Asia's had a banner year. Everything went right. At the beginning of the year, there was a lot of concerns and issues with the change in administration here, but it's been a terrific year. Exports have done well, and domestic demand has done well. So very, very strong growth, recovery, commodity prices came up, and you can see it in the equity market performance.
Can you give me some examples of industries, sectors that were the bright spots in 2017?
The surprise was how strong the export sector performed. So tech did well. Then commodities recovered, and that helped some of the weaker sectors like steel and others stabilize. Digital economy, the digital Asia is doing very, very well. Fintech we see across the region. There's a lot of startups. There's a lot of interest, and it's really picking up. The consumer sectors, because domestic demand in Asia is strong, and that is showing up in the consumer industries. Banks have also revived. The weak spot remains the property sector.
How much of Asia's growth is thanks to China and its economy?
I'm going to step back a little bit, because roughly about Asia today accounts for about 30% of global GDP and about 60% of global growth. And China is a key part of that story. But it's not all China, because the region trades with each other, invests with each other, and does well. So I would say, China has been slowing a little bit, but growth is still close to 6.7, something like that. So China was an important part of the story, but not the whole story.
So China aside, which countries have led Asia's growth and which countries dragged it down?
So if I look at Asia, the region as a whole, and I'm really focusing on emerging Asia because that's where the interesting story is. So China is growing at about 6.7. Next year will be a little bit slower. India slowed a little bit because of the demonetization shock, as well as the GST implementation shock. These were reforms they needed to do, but it slowed down the economy. But still, India is expected to grow about 6.8. Philippines is doing well. Philippines is growing at about 6.5, 6.7. Vietnam is a tad behind, followed by Malaysia. Malaysia got lifted by the export sector. Korea did well, though Korea is a more mature economy. So 3% growth for Korea is a great story.
The IMF said growth for 2018 for Asia,
right,
I believe 5.4%, 50% more than the global average. So that's
absolutely
significant. But it's warned over the past year,
right,
that protectionist policies
sure,
in Asia could
sure,
slow that down.
Sure.
Might we expect some of that, especially in response to what we've seen in the U.S.?
Yeah, so the protectionist policy is not so much in Asia, but it's more the external environment, I think, which the IMF is warning about. And one cause of concern is what happens here in the U.S. And, the midterm elections are coming up. And the concern is if U.S. turns more inward-looking in its trade policies, which could be a source of concern. I mean, so far, NAFTA and TPP, TPP was not in place anyway, and the NAFTA issue hasn't affected Asia, but this is something of concern to the region as a whole. So it's very important that within the region continues to do structural reforms and trade opening.
What are some of the risks for the region?
The key kind of macro risks which we worry about, and one is, U.S. policy. We've seen the tax cuts, and that has a consequence in higher deficits, and the Fed is in a gradual tightening mode. So if you have a very sharp reversal in currently the benign scenario for bond yields and markets, you could see a return to risk aversion. And foreign investors are they have large positions in Asian debt and equity markets. So you could see some temporary outflows there. And then, of course, trade is something we talked about, and what happens to U.S. trade policy is important. And the U.S., of course, is pushing for fair bilateral trade. So there'll be a lot of, we think, a lot of pressure coming both on China and Korea. and that's something to watch out for. Then there's the China-related risks. You know, what we'd really like to see in China is, you know, more focus on deleveraging and some of the credit cycles issues and a lot of debt. And, you know, the more urgently that China begins to tackle these issues, it'll be in a more sustainable growth outlook. And last and not least is the geopolitical stuff. The elections around the corner, North Korea, South Korea is a big issue, Korean Peninsula, and some of the domestic political issues in the region.